Linux is so flexible. It can boot from an incredible number of methods or sources. Now, there are several different things we need to understand about the boot processes. Like, is it hardware based or is it software based? And I'll tell you what I mean about that in a minute. But there are just this multitude of ways that a Linux system can boot. It can boot over PXE or Pixie boot. If you haven't seen that, it's just the coolest thing ever. It's when it boots up completely over the network. We can boot from USB, from CD. iPXE is a more advanced version of Pixie. I'll talk about that too. And then ISO images, just like the .iso file, you can actually make a grub2 entry that will boot directly from the ISO, even though you don't have it burned to a disk or to a USB drive. It can live on your system, and you can have a grub menu item that boots directly to that ISO image. It's really flexible what it can do. But that hardware software thing I wanted to talk about, because where the boot process is taking place is really important. Some of it is Linux specific, some of it is not. So first of all, let's talk about the hardware things. Now, when I say hardware, I mean the BIOS or the UEFI, the part that takes place before Linux is ever introduced. And PXE is one of those things. PXE, which stands for Pre-Boot Execution Environment, is the way that the hardware says, okay, I don't see a hard drive, or I'm not set up to use a hard drive, so I'm going to query the network. And it just queries a DHCP server, and the DHCP server responds with not only an IP address, which is what DHCP servers normally do, but also a boot file and a TFTP location. A TFTP server is just a place you can store files on a network. And then basically the computer then downloads that image, that boot image, from the TFTP server, and that's where Linux comes into play. That kernel or that boot file is the Linux kernel, so it downloads it off the internet, off of your local network, and then it puts it in memory and boots itself from there. So PXE starts as just a hardware thing and then turns into a software. There's also iPXE, which is very similar, but instead of using TFTP to download that thing, it allows you to use HTTP, which is faster and usually more reliable than the old-fashioned TFTP. But it's very similar in concept, iPXE, if your computer supports it. Then USB, this is also right on the hardware. Now, the hardware determines exactly how to boot from the USB, but on the USB itself is where the Linux code is, right? So the hardware knows that it can boot from USB. Same thing with CD. And to be quite honest, same thing with a hard drive, right? The hard drive is booted to because the computer itself understands how to do that. But when Linux comes into play, we'll say the software side of things, this is once it loads into Linux, Linux does some things on its own, like the ISO booting with grub2. That's after Linux starts, right? Or after grub starts, it says, okay, I'm in grub now. What are we going to do? We're going to either mount a partition, or we're going to look at this ISO file and actually use that as our operating system, just like it was burned to a CD. So some of this stuff is software. This is where you like select a kernel. This is where you can have memtest. So a lot of the stuff is done in software, but most things, actually all things, have to start in the hardware. Otherwise, you're never going to, get to the point where the software takes control. But it's important to know that PXE, iPXE, these are not Linux specific boot methods. These are boot methods the computer supports that Linux also supports, in that they can provide the boot file. So I don't want you to confuse PXE, network booting, with something specific to Linux. Same with USB and CD. We can boot Windows from USB or CD. And it works, because the hardware supports it. If I'm honest, probably the most fun way to boot a computer is using PXE, only because there's no media, right? It just boots directly off the network, and for some reason that's just really awesome to be a part of. It's really awesome to see. But there are multiple ways that you can boot Linux, and it's important to know that they're all there. It's okay if you don't know exactly how to, boot from an ISO file using grub2. Anybody's going to have to Google the specifics of that in order to make it work. But knowing all these different processes exist for booting a computer, that's vital, because that will help you learn and help you troubleshoot when you run into a booting issue. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.